Welcome to the Italian Wine Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Vinitaly International Wine and Spirits Exhibition. The 54th edition of Vinitaly was held from 10 to the 13th of April. If you missed it, don't worry. Go to vinitalyplus.com for on-demand recordings of all the sessions from the exhibition. And remember to save the date. The next edition of Vinitaly will be held from the 2nd to the 5th of April 2023.
Thanks for tuning into my new show, Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. I'm Steve Raye, author of the book, How to Get U.S. Market Ready. And in my previous podcast, I shared some of the lessons I've learned from 30 years in the wine and spirits business, helping brands enter and grow in the U.S. market. This series will be dedicated to the personalities who have been working in the Italian wine sector in the U.S., their experiences, challenges, and personal stories. I'll uncover the roads that they walked, shedding light on current trends, business strategies, and their unique brands. So, thanks for listening in, and let's get to the interview. Hi, this is Steve Raye, and welcome to this week's edition of Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People on the Italian Wine Podcast. My guest this week is Susan Kostrzewa, who was most recently editor at Wine Enthusiast. She's an award-winning journalist and content specialist with more than 20 years of experience in luxury, lifestyle, culture, wine, food, and drinks publishing. She's also president of Resplendent Inc., a content creator. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So the big question I had is, you had one of the best jobs in wine, a lot of people think, and now you're going into something that's kind of unknown. Why did you do that, and how do you feel about that?
Why did I do that? So I was with Wine Enthusiast for 15 years in various positions, editorial positions, and obviously I left once I sort of was in that role of editor-in-chief. I loved my time there. I learned so much. What a great run. But it was time for me to do something new. And so in my role at Enthusiast, and then just generally in my, sort of involvement in the wine industry, I recognized a real need for someone with my skill set, not only for editorial brands, but for wine brands who really needed help with their content strategy, their brand communication, and their messaging. And I always call it the storytelling of the wines. And something I find really interesting. There's a strategy involved. There's creativity involved. Obviously have some great relationships with people and know them and know what they're trying to do. So, that's kind of why I created what I did. It wasn't a grand plan, to be honest. It just kind of organically happened based on needs in the market.
Yeah, I'm seeing what's going on. I mean, everything's kind of evolving. And so if somebody isn't filling that niche, it's a great opportunity for you. There's a phrase out there people have used that print is dead. It's not. I agree with you on that principle. I still read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal every day and a whole bunch of other publications. But the traditional role of magazines has been usurped by all kinds of things digital, from social media to e-commerce, which I think is a form of social media, in fact. So this whole print-digital divide and the concept of storytelling, as you defined it, seems to be kind of the thread that runs through communications that works. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you were just referencing print. I think that what's happened in media is I wouldn't say that any one aspect is dead necessarily, including print. I think we're just expected to be quite diverse now. We need to be telling, stories where the audiences are. And that is all over the place. That's in the podcast space. That's in the virtual event space, that's in regular sort of online article space, and then of course podcasting. So, I think that is part of what's happening, and I feel that that's true of brands and companies and products as well. They're expected to be in all those places, telling a great story, an interesting story, and a story that is crafted to the audience, who is following the specific platform. So, it has evolved, and I think too, just the whole idea of the digital space for wine has evolved a lot and has become so sort of front and center. I think it was happening before COVID. We were going in that direction. And I think COVID definitely pushed the market and pushed, really honestly, the media space, communication space fully in that direction. I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think it's wonderful, because the idea is we want more people drinking wine. And wherever we can be that they are, without the barriers that we've had in the past, either physical or other barriers, this is allowing us to speak to a bigger audience and for them to know more about the wines that we love. So I think it's positive, but it has changed a lot.
Yeah, the rules and standards, if they applied, no longer apply. I think a lot of this hangs on where you're from. I deal with a lot of international brands. In many cases, they're farmers, and they won't have the capability of being able to do digital no more nor less than they were able to do print in terms of PR outreach. Add to that all the stuff that's happening with e-commerce, and I'm going to be interviewing Burkhard Nessen actually later this afternoon, talking about how e-commerce has changed too. But it's also how things are monetized and how they're paid. So in the old days of print magazines, you would buy an ad and it won't be seen for 3 months after you place the insertion order, articles appear. You got plenty of time to think about that. And there was one outlet. Maybe there was a website that was associated with it. Now, the need is to be consistent in communications across the board. And that means from what you say on the label, whether or not you have a QR code and where that leads to and what kind of information, to what others are saying about you. The concept there is optimizing your brand presence online, meaning what does Wine Searcher say about you? What does Vivino say about you? And all of that kind of stuff. So stuff that's in your control and stuff that's not necessarily in your control. It's kind of exploding. How do you get a handle on all this?
I mean, how do you get a handle on it? I think that you can't possibly get a handle on everything, but you have to prioritize what it is that you think will be most important and impactful to your brand. Again, whether it's a media brand, whether it's a product or a wine brand. I think that it's important to be active in the space and seeing what others are doing. And I know that sometimes that can be very difficult with the schedules people have, but I think, just being aware of what your peers are doing, what your peer companies are doing, and, you can learn a lot from that as well. But it's prioritizing. I think you have to decide what your focuses are and really, really go for those. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but I think you have to do it right. You can't be all things to all people. It's better, I think, to focus in a few areas that you can really drill down into and do well, because the market and the audience knows when something's done lazily or isn't clear or is not of quality. So, there's a lot of pressure now.
Yeah, and I think that the potential negative impact of doing a poor job may be even more significant than the positive impact of doing a good job, because, as you pointed out, doing a good job is expected. I mean, the standards are set by companies like Amazon and Facebook and Instagram, who have all those resources. And we're dealing in the wine industry now, which doesn't have those resources. So one area I did want to dig in a little bit more, and then we can move on. But the idea is compensation for content producers. There's been a lot of discussion lately about influencers, the role that they play and how they get compensated, the separation of church and state, the role of paid advertising, even to the point of Google and Facebook ads, where they're doing it by an ad auction method. They're ads. Okay, somebody's paying for the content to be there, as opposed to the equivalent of PR, which is like third-party reinforcement, if you will. Somebody else is generating the content, but you're trying to influence that. How do you see that evolving from the simple world, if I can use that term, of print that we all came from, to this new world of electronic communications?
Well, there's no question that those worlds are more integrated than they used to be. And, we used to talk a lot about that at Enthusiast, where, we really, of course, not only journalistically, but because of the tasting program that we had to be extremely careful about how we proceeded with those, those types of relationships and how things were portrayed. And, I used to hear from people in media, well, it's changing and the consumer doesn't care. The consumer's used to seeing this, et cetera, et cetera. I always took sort of that middle.
It's like, it's good enough.
Yeah, they don't care as much as you do. You mentioned earlier, again, this is not me throwing anyone under a bus. It was just industry people that I had talked to. Some believed in it, some didn't. As a journalist, and I think you have a journalistic background as well, it's a hard thing to see, but I also recognize that there are changes. The world as we knew it have changed. The new generations are very used to this extremely integrated sort of, advertising model that we're seeing now. I mean, obviously with native advertising, but there are so many other things. And you mentioned influencers. I think influencers, as much as I will be totally honest, in the very beginning of brands using influencers, I sort of rolled my eyes a bit. I thought, really, is this really going to resonate with audiences? Is this what they care about? In most cases, it did resonate and it did move the needle. And if they were chosen properly, it could make a huge difference. And I had to change my tune because I saw that a lot of what was happening on social media that was really getting engagement, it was this group of people who are doing an amazing job of getting new audiences, interested. Do I think there still needs to be a clear delineation or some delineation to indicate editorial content versus advertising content? Yes, I do. And I think the brands who are smart know to do that. And again, that's a transparency that it shouldn't work against you. It should actually work for your brand if you do it properly.
Okay, one of the issues has been that we've moved from an era where the experts, quote unquote, determine the success or failure of a given brand in the marketplace, Robert Parker and the magazines, Wine Enthusiast and Wine Spectator. Now it's a function of peers, not pundits, that are kind of running the conversation. Can you comment on that?
I still, and again, not to sound too egalitarian on everything that I say, but I believe there's a place for everyone. I do think it is natural and it makes sense that the model has moved towards a peer model because, again, that is at its best, let's put it that way.
Word of mouth. I mean, that's kind of where it all began.
Well, it's word of mouth, but at its best, social media is supposed to be a community. Obviously, it can become very divisive, but it's supposed to be a place where people share information, and they are listening to their peers. And I think even before that took off in wine, I mean, that was a lot of the times the way that even my friends who weren't in the industry, it was word of mouth. Oh, my friend told me about this great, Prosecco, or my friend, told me I should be trying wines from Etna or whatever. And it was a lot of that. So I feel like that's natural and an okay direction for things to go in. Do I think there's no place though for the expert? I think there is still a place because at the end of the day, there's a lot of information out there, even among peers, and people who are learning about wine still want that, at least that feedback. They may choose. I think they're savvier now. They don't take it for gospel anymore. But I think they still want it. And then they can make their own decisions. Someone is vetted through these tastings. They've done the work. They've done all that heavy lifting, and they're offering their opinions to you. There's value in that. The question is, what do you do with it? Do you take it again as gospel, or do you say, okay, I know this person's palate. I like some of it. I'm not going to try some of it. I'm fine with that. I think there's a place for it.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental issues, compensation for that, it used to be, you would pay somebody for writing and there was a fixed fee per word. And that's no longer the way you get paid. And a lot of it is you don't get paid at all. So let's move to a specific example. As we were originally talking, you had said that you were involved with Greek wines. I've had some experience with Greek wines as well, so that kind of intrigued me. Can you talk about your experience with wines from Greece and how some of what we just talked about applies?
Yeah, I think, I have been extremely privileged to cover wines. I was covering, I think, for almost 7 years, maybe even longer, maybe even 10. At Enthusiast, I was the critic of Greek wine and was always intrigued by that category because of the history, of course, an incredible place, and just the uniqueness of the varieties. So one of the things that struck me right away when I first came in was, as often happens, they were grappling with how do we get into the U.S. market? What do we hang our hat on? Because this was, again, this is 10 years ago at least. Do we believe in and support our indigenous varieties, or do we talk about the international varieties that we make well here? And I think as far as marketing goes, there was some confusion as to what the clear message was going to be in the market. What are the wines? What do they stand for? And how do you even pronounce them?
I was going to say that's the first thing right there. Are you ready to go? Does not look like that.
And I have a name that's difficult. And even I was like, wow, these Greek words are quite different. So I think, what was hard for that particular and I think they've worked it out to some extent, and I'm thrilled to see this. But I think in the beginning, it was like, okay, how do we make this culture of wine, the words, these unknown varieties, these regions no one's ever necessarily heard of, in the U.S., how do we make this easy and palatable for an American audience? And I think there was the possibility of homogenizing it. And thankfully, I don't believe that was the route that they took. They recognized over time, these are varieties that really are made nowhere else in the world. They're extremely unique. The growing conditions are incredible. Like, there's a story here.
Absolutely. I mean, they got stories, they got myths.
They've got myths. I mean, it's 4,000 years of, who has that? It's built-in storytelling. It's a built-in great story. But I think, they had to, as a category, really believe in that and lean into that. And in doing that, I believe, have done a great job of breaking into the market. I mean, do I think that, the same person who's drinking, maybe a very ubiquitous Chardonnay from California is going to go and try an Agavito? Maybe not. But a curious wine drinker, and probably somebody, especially with this, the emerging generations that are coming into wine, are they interested in these wines? Absolutely.
But let's talk about what you did for them. I mean, that same conversation we just had could apply to Armenia, Georgia, and any unfamiliar Turkey region on the planet. But what did you do for them, and how did your new role in digital? What role did you play in that?
Well, first of all, I showed up. I actually physically went to the wine region. I mean, I know that sounds like a very basic thing, but I don't think that Greece have been prioritized by a lot of people in the industry as far as on, in tasting programs and larger media. It was sort of an afterthought. And I was in a great position because of my, my rank and my role at the magazine. I was able to say, no, I'd like to prioritize this category a bit. I think we should be covering it. And I want to go, and I would like to spend some time there. And so I did some pretty extensive traveling through Greece, and multiple times was there. And, really from tiny little sort of organic producers to the big boys. I met with everyone. I tasted with everyone. I had, incredible partners in Wines of Greece, just amazing. Sophia Prepera there is, still a friend, and just was an amazing sort of guide through that space for me. But what I did was I tasted the wines extensively, and I wrote about them. And I gave them, obviously I was covering them online. So the enthusiast audience was exposed to a region or a category that probably wasn't getting enough exposure.
Let's change direction here a little bit. Thinking about the difference between export brands and domestic brands, one of the fundamental differences is that the only time a wine can bypass the three-tier system is a domestic wine selling direct to the consumer. That avenue, that route to market, is not available to export brands. So can you compare and contrast from the perspective of export brands, the challenges of export brands, and maybe what are the common mistakes and successes that you've seen people have taking Italian brands, and some of them are Greek varietals, right? Like Aglianico.
Yeah. I think one of the difficulties, of course, the system can be extremely complicated. Every single state has its own sort of, parameters, which can be confusing. I think it's not recognizing the uniqueness of each of the markets in the U.S., and that can be overwhelming. So beyond the system itself, it's also either doing the work of extensively traveling throughout the U.S. and really visiting the regions, Chicago versus New York market versus Charlotte, they're very different. And I think sometimes, export brands, they just sort of see it as, even if they know in their heart of hearts, look, there is clearly like a very faceted situation of culture in wine drinking in the U.S., they kind of try to do one size fits all, regardless of market. And, as far as their messaging and their education and honestly, even just the way in which they engage themselves in the market. I think it's just knowing and spending the time to learn how different the markets are and what they're looking for. I think that, and I think you and I talked about this at one point, or somehow there was an exchange about virtual events and how that, the virtual space has made some of this a little easier potentially. Because, that sort of hand sell and boots on the ground approach, which is very important, but very expensive and time consuming and tiring for, depending on the size of the brand, that can take up a lot of energy and time, which, it can be tough when you're trying to run a winery. I think virtual events and tastings can really help. And I think that can be one way that you can expose your brand to people in the market, whether it's retailers or educators or whatever you're looking for. That's one direction that, again, virtual is sort of helping us. So yeah, I think it's knowing your market and doing the homework and really understanding the uniqueness between each of the markets as an expert brand.
And that's a big challenge for a lot of people whose primary job is making wine. Let me talk about it or ask about it this way. So you've had a job as for a long time as editor, watching, observing, commenting, synthesizing, interpreting, right? Now you're a lot closer to the boots on the feet on the street and boots on the ground that you're talking about, because you're responsible in many cases for actual brand performance and sales and those kinds of things, if not directly, certainly indirectly. And you talked about the role of brand ambassador, and I've seen that come and change and have some thoughts on it, but I'd be interested in yours. Is it still a reasonable strategy because it's so expensive and not scalable? I kind of led the question there. Sorry about that. You're leading the witness.
Yes, I think it is a difficult strategy. I think that, again, even a larger brand, I mean, the cost of doing that work, doing the sort of boots on the ground, sort of constant interface type of situation is very hard. And again, I think that's where possibly digital can come in. If you can, create some type of outreach and education and interaction in those markets through virtual events. Again, I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but it is part of the picture for the future, I think.
Yeah, well, the direct communication between the winery, we no longer need the intermediaries. So one of the other big changes today, a lot of what we've been talking about, but manifests itself is the availability, the overwhelming availability of information in such a broad range of places. You've got label identification or label recognition technology. So you essentially have a encyclopedia open in front of you when you're looking at a bottle of wine and taking a picture of it. There's so much information available to consumers where it used to be much more limited. Now with Wine Search or Vivino and everything else, you can find out more information than you want to know about many, many things. How is that changing how consumers shop, do you think?
Well, I think, again, from my perspective as a content person, it's been interesting to see how much diversification has happened with education. I mean, I think what we're seeing is more information, more education, more content in more places. And I think as far as, that can influence obviously how somebody shops. And we talked about storytelling earlier. I think, the not only do the brands, but also the Vivinos, et cetera, they're starting to get into the content game a little bit more. They're recognizing that it's not just about price or score. People want to understand what's behind the brand. They want to know what the stories are, et cetera. So you're just seeing more information out there than ever. That can be overwhelming. I mean, there are a couple of ways of looking at that. One is great. The more information, the better, and more perspectives, the better. And that's all good. The question is that overwhelming to the consumer? How do they know where they're supposed to go? I think that's still remaining to be seen. I think that the future consumer of wine is a lot more comfortable with that sort of richness of information than even maybe somebody from my generation was. It's more natural to them.
Okay, so lots of information available to a lot of people, to the point that you can get a graduate level education in something as obscure as Greek or Turkish wines or wines from Irpinia, for example. And then the flip side of that is when somebody's shopping in a store and there's a sign above a bottle of wine that says 92. Can you talk about scores?
Okay, so we talked about expertise earlier, and has the role of the expert become obsolete? Is it really more about peers? Is it, where are people going for this information? I feel similarly about scores. I don't think they should drive everything that happens in wine. I think score can only tell you so much of what a wine is. But do I think that most consumers appreciate that guidance? I do. I think most people are busy, and it's easy for them to generally to see a score and understand it. It's something that we were raised with, and in school there's a familiarity to a score that can make make it easy for a consumer. I don't think they place as much weight in it as they used to. Now the industry still loves it. The trade loves to have their scores, and I understand that. The consumer, I think, is a little less driven by scores maybe than they used to be. I also think, maybe in future scoring, maybe it's not the 100-point scale, maybe it's stars, or it's, indicators or something else. It's a little more friendly to a consumer. But I do think they appreciate that. And I do think there's a place for it. So
one of the things I tell my clients is I don't really care what your thoughts on scores are, and you don't really care about what my thoughts on scores are. Just get them. So the first question you're going to be asked by somebody in the U.S. trade is, do you have scores? And if the answer is no, the conversation stops right there. So go out and get scores, and you can argue how many angels can fit on the head of a pin when you're sitting there with a bunch of 90 pluses. And if you don't have 90 plus, then don't talk about them.
Yeah, don't talk about them, or find a way of messaging that and saying this is a really affordable, delicious wine. Put it into a context that makes sense. It doesn't have to be 95 points if it's a great food wine that you're going to sit on the patio with in the summer. I mean, there are ways. It always sort of discouraged me to see brands getting so upset about a wine that might be an 88-point wine, which for a $10 or $12 wine, it was like, this is a great score. Don't immediately assume that, this is going to turn somebody off. Now, I understand there are a lot of nuances to who's interpreting that, but I do think that, you're right. I think just, you do need the scores in our environment in the US for sure. People are used to seeing it. I believe it doesn't tell the full story.
Yeah, for sure. But I think the point you made, that it's more important in the trade than it is to consumers, is absolutely true because of the ubiquity of information out there. One changing direction here, you were on the board for Women of the Vine, and I did an interview with Deborah, and I thought it was really fascinating and interesting to me, being an old person who doesn't, maybe it isn't so relevant to me, or it is relevant to me now, but I don't know that much about it. Talk about what you were doing on the board then and what your role is now.
Deborah Brenner, yes. I met Deborah years ago when she first was putting her book together, which I believe is called Women of the Vine. It was the sort of, the impetus for this entire events and this platform she created. So I'd known her over the years, and I think I attended the second event in Napa, and just was so impressed and recognized, no question, that there was such a need for a space for women in the industry. There just really wasn't. Even when I came into the industry, it was still largely male, an older group, and definitely no real diversity. So I wanted to get involved from the early stages, and thankfully she and I always sort of got along. And I was asked to speak at the event and moderate a few panels. And then over time, she asked me to be on the board. And I was on the advisory board for a couple of years. She changed the model of that board and then sort of started to apply people to specific areas that made sense for them. So what I transitioned into was helping create the program for the event, the content for the event, helping to direct some of those sessions. And I did that for several years. Now I'm, the event has changed. It's kind of went digital. I believe that I'm not sure if she's actually doing it in person again this year. I'll have to check that, but I'm a little less involved now, still certainly in touch with Deborah. And, I'm still very involved in the space. And I've got some different appointments and groups that I'm going to be getting involved with that I can't really talk about quite yet. But I'm working on that right now.
Well, back to the DEI thing, though. Do you think change is happening? And, I'll leave it at that. Do you think change is happening in the industry from being a bunch of old white guys?
Yeah, it's changing. I think Is it changing fast enough and in all the ways that we would like to? No, it's going to take time. There are definitely some successes and there are definitely some setbacks. It's a traditional environment. What I think is exciting is I just love seeing these new perspectives and new voices coming out, especially in social media. Again, an incredible platform for the change that's happening. I just love to see that. And it's just making the industry so much more interesting and so much, again, richer, because there's just, why would you want only the perspective that you know? It's great to have new voices in this space. I think it's still very tough. I think there's still a lot of tradition and, there's a long way to go, but at least we're moving in the right direction right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's something. Okay. So we're coming to the end of the interview. I like to end them asking my guests, what's the big takeaway of all the things that we talked about here? Is there a simple practical idea or practice that someone could put to use immediately to have an impact on their business?
Well, I think a couple of the takeaways would be just in the work that I have done and am now doing with these brands, again, both editorial and commercial, is really being clear on who your audience is and who you want it to be. Be very clear from the start. It all trickles down from there. The other thing I talk a lot to people about is your story is not just about what's in the bottle. As much as it may seem like a cliche, it's the generation now, and I don't even mean the emerging generation, I also mean wine drinkers of all ages now really want to understand what you're about. What do you believe in as a company? Who are the people who work for you, and how do they, what are their perspectives? There's a multifaceted story that needs to be told. Of course, what's in the bottle has to be good. That's expected, but there's a lot more to your story than just that. We talked earlier about recognizing that messaging is no longer just the written word. You really need to be thinking about audio, video, virtual events as a form of engagement. And it doesn't mean you have to do them all. It doesn't mean you have to do them all well, but you need to make sure that you're engaging in some ways in at least a few of those areas. And really, as we said, trying to spend some time with it. Don't rush to do it. Don't put something off that will, as you said, damage you. But know that you need to be looking in that direction. And I think that one of the other things that I sort of alluded to earlier regarding scores, and if you don't get a 90 point or 95 points, maybe you get an 88 point, but you can put that wine into context. I think that's really important for wine consumers now. Certainly American wine consumers, they like that context. Maybe that's an environment. It's where to drink them. It's pairings. It's a lifestyle element that really does resonate with the U.S. audience. And I think, specifically, the Italian wine market does a great job of this. I think because it's so much a part of the culture of Italy. It's just an understanding that you are going to be drinking wine with food in this environment, et cetera. So I think the Italians have got this down. And are doing it well. They recognize it's just not about putting a bottle in front of someone. There's more to the environment, and I think that is, of course, if that's not your forte, that's the kind of thing that I help to do with some of the people I work with, is come in and say I can help you to create that environment and at least talk about it. So I think those are some of the things. The last thing I would say is the world that we're in now. Certainly the virtual and digital world is about a dialogue. Whether it's a real dialogue or a perceived dialogue, you want your messaging and your relationship with your audience to feel collaborative and not to be dictating to them. You try to create a conversation. That a lot of that has to do with the tone of language that you use, and just your overall sort of outreach to them, and always thinking about how can we create this feeling that we're in this together. I think that's a value.
Brilliant. I agree 100%. And challenges how and how to pay for it. So big shout out to Susan Kostrzewa. And I'm thrilled to learn that I've been mispronouncing it all these years.
I'm sure that's normal. Just call me Susan K. It's fine.
For joining us today on Get U.S. Market Ready with Italian Wine People. We didn't spend so much time today talking about Italian wine as we did about the wine industry. And coming from your previous position, I think you're a very eloquent voice. So thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate it. It was really, really great to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Italian Wine Podcast, brought to you by Vinitaly International Wine and Spirits Exhibition, the biggest drinks trade fair in the world. Save the date! The next edition of Vinitaly will be held the 2nd through the 5th of April 2023. Remember to subscribe to Italian Wine Podcast and catch us on SoundCloud, Spotify, and wherever you get your pods. You can also find us at ItalianWinePodcast.com. Chin chin!
Hi guys, I'm Joy Livingston and I am the producer of the Italian Wine Podcast. Thank you for listening. We are the only wine podcast that has been doing a daily show since the pandemic began. This is a labor of love and we are committed to bringing you free content every day. Of course, this takes time and effort, not to mention the cost of equipment, production, and editing. We would be grateful for your donations, suggestions, requests, and ideas. For more information on how to get in touch, go to ItalianWinePodcast.com.